played in 2015 at Clemson. It came down to a 2-point conversion. I think most of us fans who don't have a stake in the game that just want to see good football will take much of the same in a 24-22 Clemson decision. Then, of course, the team's much different here in 2018 and the stakes much higher. We bring in Ben Belden from Slap the Sign. You can also catch his podcast Under the Dome, talking Notre Dame athletics. Ben, how you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. So what strikes me first and foremost about this game is, of course, the 13.5-point spread. And the first thing I hear out of any analyst's mouth, or if I look at a preview online, which I don't do a whole lot of that, I typically just go with my own analysis because I've seen these teams play a whole lot of football this year, is that Clemson is just so athletic. They're just so good, so freakishly fast and athletic. NFL caliber players all over the place. How is Notre Dame going to keep up? That's what I keep hearing, and I think that's way overplayed myself.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It seems like if you ask anyone who's not in the Notre Dame circle, I suppose people go with that as kind of their fallback, because I'm not convinced a lot of people that say that have watched Notre Dame this year. I mean, Notre Dame has some NFL level talent at just about every position group, whether we're talking offense or defensive line, linebackers, receivers, safeties, all of that. So I hear people say that, and I think it's easy to say that about Clemson because people watch them a lot, and they've been in the college football playoff a lot. But I think that Notre Dame kind of has the same type of thing. They've got NFL players all over the place.
Yeah, and what's interesting about these two teams, and you rarely see this because of the ACC contract with Notre Dame, is we've got two teams in the playoff that have resumes that overlap considerably. I think 4 to 5 games are the same. We got Wake Forest, we got Syracuse, we got Florida State, we've got somebody else in there that I'm forgetting. And the results, it's not like, well, Notre Dame struggled with all these teams and Clemson did not. They rolled all of them. It's a mixed bag of results, and I don't do the transitive property much, but once we get 4 to 5 games, I think there's some interesting comparisons. And Notre Dame, for example, played Syracuse much tougher and better and rolled them, the best team of the 4 or 5 that they both played, while Clemson, of course, struggled, albeit with a backup quarterback for the second half. But still with a backup quarterback in play, and the Clemson team being at home struggled in that game. So do you take a whole lot from the score comparisons or the breakdowns in common opponents?
I really don't, because even when Notre Dame dominates a team, on paper, like if you only look at the box score, they don't look quite as dominant. I mean, Notre Dame, for the most part, they played a close first half against Virginia Tech. And then if you watch the second half of that game against Virginia Tech, then Notre Dame dominated that football game. So I don't know. Brian Kelly in his tenure at Notre Dame has not really, he gets into kind of a mode, I want to say, where he kind of like, they get up a few scores and he's out there experimenting a little bit rather than, sticking to the bread and butter and running up the score and that type of thing. He's doing certain things, putting people in, adverse conditions almost on purpose to, prepare his teams for other situations and things. And, there's something to be said about that. And there's something to be said about not just putting your foot on the accelerator and just crushing a team too. So, Notre Dame's not the team that puts 70 on people and runs up the score, for lack of a better term. Clemson has the ability sort of and the mentality to dominate. And I mean, Clemson's in a different place in their program a little bit as well. I mean, they're established, and Notre Dame's still kind of on the upswing. So I think that kind of factors into it a little bit as well. Talent-wise, like I'm going to go back to, I think that, talent-wise, I'd probably give the edge to Clemson a little bit, but Notre Dame is not far behind the way that a lot of people seem to be, saying that they are.
If people believe in recruiting rankings, I don't have them in front of me, but I'm guessing that the two aren't as separated as many people would think. Clemson has built a national program, and Dabo Swinney has done extremely well, but they haven't brought in like top 2 and 3 classes. They're more in the 7 to 10 range typically, and Notre Dame's not far behind that. So if you believe in recruiting rankings, which I do over time, not particularly directed at one player or any specific class, but over time, I think they're very telling. You look at the top 25 on the field versus the top 25 in the recruiting rankings, and without a couple aberrations in there, you basically know who the good and the bad teams are. And the talent by that measurement isn't that far off. The one place, and I'm not, I'm kind of slanting this conversation toward a Notre Dame upset based on a few things that I'm saying here, but one place where I think Notre Dame can really possibly take advantage if they can neutralize, of course, that massive front line of Clemson, which is just NFL ready, is tearing up the secondary that's been exposed a number of times in Ian Book and those very skilled big receivers doing some damage in the secondary.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. Clemson's secondary, hasn't been statistically great in a lot of their games. I think most recently against South Carolina, which was their last regular season game, they gave up 35 points and 600 yards, and it was mostly, through the air that they were doing those types of things. So I think that, when you factor in that Notre Dame has about the most accurate passer in college football statistically, with, some receivers that, Notre Dame has spread the ball around pretty well throughout the year, and Miles Boykin kind of emerged late in the year as kind of the go-to guy, and Chase Claypool as a clear number 2. And then you got Chris Fink, who everyone talks about Renfro from Clemson, but and how good he is, but Chris Fink had similar numbers, better numbers even. Notre Dame has some guys that they can throw the ball to, and tight end Alize Mack and Cole Kmet can probably cause some issues with Clemson's linebackers and pass coverage as well. So, that's going to be where Notre Dame, I think, leans. I think they'll struggle to run a lot, but they'll be able to get the pass game going a little bit, and then hopefully the run game can play off of that a little bit as well.
Yeah, so Hunter Renfro is a player that obviously has his certain niche in college football history, and he has earned it based on big plays in championship games. So he's kind of a different sort. So, he's not an NFL body guy. He will probably be in a camp, I would think, definitely, and I wouldn't be surprised if he makes an NFL roster, but he's just not the typical Clemson receiver. But he's got, in the first championship game as a freshman against Alabama, 2 touchdown catches, and then, of course, the next year he caught the game-winning touchdown pass. So he's got that cachet that he's earned of legacy, but in regards to doing damage on the field consistently week to week, he's a good receiver, but he's not a game changer typically, but that doesn't mean he's not going to catch the key pass or a third down in a 4-minute drive with the game on the line in the last few minutes. So when you look at the Notre Dame situation, what are your concerns against Clemson? What would be those key positional battles or units on the Notre Dame side that would cause you a bit of concern?
First off, and I kind of mentioned this in the last answer, but I'll elaborate, is that I'm worried about Notre Dame's ability to run the ball. And it'll be interesting to see. Notre Dame's going to have to put together some sort of a balanced offensive attack, but it's really going to rely on the arm of Ian Book. But if they're not able to run the ball at all, and I'm saying, kind of the consensus is that maybe they run the ball 25 times and net 5 yards, but if they're able to throw the ball a little bit and then once in a while pull off a 25, 30-yard run, and that's your running game, I think that's good enough for this game, because Notre Dame has demonstrated the ability on offense to adjust, especially after halftime. So I think that the offense is going to ultimately, score in the 20s, and if, they're able to achieve at least some semblance of balance. And kind of on the other side of the ball, then, Clemson runs it really well. Notre Dame's, defense really it doesn't have a big glaring weakness, I suppose. But if Clemson's able to get their running game going, and then Notre Dame can't get after the quarterback because they're off balance and things, then that obviously can cause problems as well. So I guess it's kind of the same answer. If Notre Dame can achieve balance on offense, they'll be all right. And if they are able to, disrupt Clemson's balance on defense, they'll be all right. And if they're not, then it's not going to go well for Notre Dame.
Yeah, I would think a decent game for Dexter Williams. And of course, he's used to logging 150 yards against teams. But against this defense, I would think if he gets the ball 18 to 20 times and he can break loose for 12 to 20 yard gains 2 to 3 times and gains 75 or 80 yards, gets 3.5 to 4 yards per carry, that would be
Right.
decent.
Right. Yeah. And that's kind of been Notre Dame's MO all year. I mean, I think back to like the Virginia Tech game. Notre Dame couldn't run the ball at all in the first half, and early in the third quarter, Dexter Williams goes 98 yards for a touchdown on the second play or whatever it was. And same thing against USC. Notre Dame couldn't run the ball. Third quarter comes along, and Dexter Williams, all of a sudden, he's scampering for 60 yards and a score, and then the game's different, and the running statistics look a lot different. But I mean, same story. Stuffed for most of the first half, but then Chip Long seems to have the ability to keep defenses, on their toes and off balance. And then that's when Notre Dame can catch him with a guy like Dexter Williams. So I expect more of the same, and I hope for more of the same against Clemson.
We've got Ben Belden on the line from Slap the Sign talking Notre Dame football, with the Irish playing its biggest game in 6 years. Of course, going back to the BCS championship game against Alabama as they take on Clemson in the national semifinal at the Cotton Bowl on Saturday night. We're about 2.5 days away. Ben, I'm always intrigued looking at the Notre Dame schedule during the offseason, because they schedule tougher than anybody in college football by the nature of having to schedule a national schedule versus teams that are locked into conferences and they play the bottom feeders. And Notre Dame doesn't really schedule bottom feeders. Maybe they throw on a Ball State, but they've got to have a break somewhere. Usually even Navy's good. This particular schedule didn't turn out to be daunting, but it was like they were facing a decent team every week. Once they got past Michigan in week 1, they never faced an elite team because Stanford was down, USC was down, Florida State was down, but they still brought talent. They still brought like top 15 type talent and maybe top 40 type teams. But it was like if anyone gets pointed to as not facing a gauntlet of a schedule, again, I read and hear things where Notre Dame's being, not that it's their fault, but the teams that they face that are supposed to be big teams were down this year. I still think that they're more battle tested than Clemson, which basically went to Texas A&M against a decent team and struggled with a 2-point win. Other than that, not a whole lot of resistance on that Clemson schedule.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It seems like, at the beginning of the year, people circled games, Michigan, Virginia Tech, Stanford were back-to-back, kind of in the middle of the season there, and then USC at the end. And then people didn't really know about Florida State, with Willie Taggart and things. They would be talented and fast, but how well were they going to put it together? So at the beginning of the season, a lot of teams were kind of, or a lot of people were looking at Notre Dame's schedule, myself included. I'm like, oh my goodness, how are they going to survive this? And then, I just named off 5 teams that could have been good. And then you've got, like you said, the Navy's in there, and Northwestern played in the Big Ten championship game. And so, I don't know. It didn't end up with like the top 10 matchups that maybe people thought that there would be. But there wasn't a week, I don't think, where Notre Dame could have just, showed up and won. And I think the week that Notre Dame kind of did that, they played Pittsburgh, who, played for the ACC title, and Notre Dame just kind of showed up and barely won. So, and then you look at Clemson's schedule, and to kind of go on to your point, they haven't played a close game since they played Syracuse in week 4 or 5, whenever that was. And none of those teams were teams necessarily. I mean, there's the common opponents there, but none of those teams were necessarily great teams either. And so I just think to myself, as a Notre Dame guy, putting on my Notre Dame, gold colored glasses for a second, like, how is Trevor Lawrence going to respond when Notre Dame puts a little bit of heat on him? If, Notre Dame's able to stop the run and that type of thing. So in that way, I think, Notre Dame has at least played in some closer type games against some, average quality type opponents. And I think that that's going to, play a little part into, their success there. The other part, and I'll wrap with this though, is that Clemson, a lot of these players, pretty much all of these players, with the exception of like the freshmen, have played in the college football playoff before. So certainly there's that aspect of it as well. So it'll be interesting to see if that college football playoff experience is going to be enough, or if, Clemson's caught off guard by the first, close game that they play all year.
Got Ben Belden on the line from Slap the Sign. You can also join him on his podcast, Under the Dome. So I just encourage you just to basically find him on Twitter. And if there's anything else that we can do to get folks to your to either Slap the Sign or Under the Dome podcast, Ben, where is the best way for people to find you?
Slapthesign.com for all of the writing stuff. If you're into that type of thing, that's great. And then if you're into podcasting, the easiest way to find all of the links for the podcast is to go to underthedomend.com. And I think I've made it very easy on people to just click, to find the most recent episode there, and then just to click whether you're looking for iTunes, SoundCloud, or whatever, you can click the link and go subscribe that way.
So some beat writers / guys that are podcasters locked in on one team, writers like yourself locked in on one team say, hey, I can't make a unbiased decision on a game prediction. I don't know if you release game predictions throughout the week or how that process works. So certainly don't disclose anything here that you want to direct anyone to Slap the Sign or to your podcast for a prediction, and don't know if you make predictions. But if you do, certainly I'll take one, or you can direct people to where they can find your prediction.
Yeah, so I'll make one right now, and I've actually done this on my own on the Under the Dome podcast, the one we recorded the day before Christmas. But you can find everybody else. We have a great group of writers over at Slap the Sign, and we release predictions on Fridays before games. And since this game is on a Saturday, they will be no different. So if you want to read everybody else's, go to slapthesign.com. They'll be up tomorrow, noon usually is when we do that. But I said on my podcast that I think that I'm going to pick the Notre Dame upset here. And, and I even made the disclaimer on my podcast that, I'm making that prediction with my heart and not necessarily my head. So there's my disclaimer there. I see a scenario where I think, and I said this as well, that Trevor Lawrence, I think at some point is going to struggle against Notre Dame's defense. It might not be right away. It might be after Notre Dame adjusts and before Clemson can make the adjustment to the adjustment. But at some point, second quarter, third quarter, I think, there will be a time where Clemson is having some difficulty against Notre Dame's defense. And if Notre Dame can kind of jump on that and seize that moment, they can maybe take control of the game at the right time. And I said 27-24 Notre Dame. Notre Dame gets up maybe like 27-14, 27-17, something like that, and holds off a Clemson rally at the end. So that's what I'm going with. You mentioned the spread, and I think the spread is absolutely kind of ridiculous at 13 points or whatever it is. Although betting is weird like that. I mean, it could be a very close game and still end up being a 14-point difference. But anyway, I'm 24.
I'm sorry, Ben. That is definitely the stipulation there, because let's say this is a 20-17 Clemson lead going into the fourth quarter. It's a very good game, really competitive game, and then it just turns out to be a 33-17 final or something like that. A late touchdown gets tacked on, but it's really a close game, and it turns out to be a 13-point spread. Yeah, the betting game, believe me, from a guy that tries to break it down, and from a very non-professional handicapper type way, yes. We all get burned each and every week. So I am curious, in light of your prediction, what your prediction was on the Notre Dame record for this season, preseason, and number two, if you picked game to game Notre Dame to lose any games this year.
I didn't make a firm prediction, but I picked that this would be a 10-2 at worst type of a season. And I was kind of thinking more along the lines of 11-1. And if things went really well, 12-0. It sort of seemed like most Notre Dame experts were really more in like the 8-4, 9-3 type of range. So I'll give myself a pat on the back there. Game to game wise, the two games that I circled as Notre Dame's going to lose one of these were when they played Stanford and Virginia Tech back to back. They were at home against Stanford one week and on the road against Virginia Tech the next. And I kind of thought they'd split those two and finish 11-1. And then a lot of people in Notre Dame circles, and I have to kind of tip my cap to some of my fellow Slap the Sign writers, they circled Northwestern as a game where that could be a trap game, because if you looked at Notre Dame's schedule, the last 5 weeks of the season, they were in Chicago one week, they were in New York to play Syracuse, they were in Southern California to play the Trojans, and then nestled in there was, Navy and San Diego, which I thought they'd survive, and they did. And then Northwestern was right after Navy. And Northwestern, when you saw Notre Dame in the last couple of weeks of the season and they didn't quite look quite as good as they had earlier in the year, factor in that travel schedule a little bit. And that's kind of where that came from. But those games towards the end were also trap games. And that's kind of where I came up with like 11-1 or 10-2. And obviously I'm very happy that I was wrong on those things and they ended up 12-0. So
absolutely. I was in the 10-2 camp with the loss to Michigan and then getting tripped up somewhere else. I couldn't really pinpoint it, but in that glut of just really good teams, teams that I thought were going to be a little bit better, especially Stanford and USC, that I thought they get tripped up somewhere. Of course, they go unscathed and make it to the college football playoff, and good for them, because one loss might have been really dicey, and probably without the conference championship game would have allowed the Buckeyes to sneak in there. Ben Belden joins us from Slap the Sign, talking Notre Dame football. Of course, the Irish taking on the Clemson Tigers in the national semifinal in Dallas.